Hey guys, so today I'm going to be doing a spoiler-free review of The Tale of Aypi by Ak Welsapar. This edition was published in 2016 as translated by W.M. Coulson. First, I want to tell you a little background about the author of this book because just hearing about the author's story made me really want to read this. So, Ak Welsapar is from Turkmenistan, which is a country that is kind of in between Russia and Kazakhstan. I throw those names out there just because those two countries I have heard of, but Turkmenistan is one that I had not heard of until I'd read this book. Turkmenistan is said to be one of the most repressive countries in the world. He wrote some investigative articles because I think he was a journalist at one point on the ecological problems in East Asia. I think it was East Asia. And because of that, he was declared a public enemy by the government, I guess, in Turkmenistan, and he was placed under house arrest. Eventually he did leave the country. I think sometime in the 90s he left, but he is still a blacklisted author there. A lot of his books are banned, including this one. And I just want to throw out there that Oscar Wilde once said, it was in the picture of Dorian Gray, there's a quote that's like, the books that the world calls immoral are the books that show the world its own shame. And I think maybe that could be applied to this book. Books that are banned, it always makes me intrigued about them because usually it says something about the place in which they're banned more than it does about the work itself in a way. Yeah, that's what's piqued my interest in this one. The Tale of Aypi, this book, it takes place in Turkmenistan at the end of the Soviet Union, so when it was all kind of coming to an end. I believe that's like I would say the late 80s or the early 90s would be my guess. I don't think it states in this book specifically what year it was, but that would be my estimate. It's set in a village where a bunch of fishermen and their families are living, and that's how they've lived for generations. So all of their ancestors grew up in the same village and were also fishermen, but this generation of fishermen are being relocated by the state somewhere else because they are wanting to build a sanatorium for asthmatics right where their village is, and they're kind of being forced out. Most of the villagers sort of resign themselves to the idea. They give up and think, yeah, we'll just move away. There's no point in kicking up a fight because we're not going to win anyway. There is one man called Araz who refuses to give it up. He wants to stay there and he'll kind of do anything to stand up for himself and his family and his community. To make matters even more complicated, there's a ghost that shows up. Her name is Aypi, and she is from many generations ago, and she is basically there to haunt them all. Overall, I thought this book was really fantastic. It definitely educated me about what life might have been like in Turkmenistan at the time, and it also delved into some really important sort of universal issues. For the most part, this book is told through dialogue between characters as well as the inner monologues of characters, so like basically thoughts that they're having, and it was really, really effective. It made this book read kind of more like a philosophical debate in a way rather than a story. Like, the story is definitely there, but there are so many discussions between characters with opposing thoughts of view as well as like internal conflicts that they're having in their inner monologues that you kind of have to work through all these different ideas, figure out what the author is saying amongst it all, and it just presents you with a lot of different views on things and really makes you think, and I really like that in a book. It reminds me of the way that Plato wrote, a philosopher. He wrote in dialogues. Also, another book, for example, that I feel is done kind of in the same way through dialogue is Franny and Zoe by J.D. Salinger. That one I have a review on, so I'll link that down below if you're interested, but that one I read sometime last year, I think, and it's very similar. So if you liked that, you might like this style of writing as well, because it reminded me of that one. There were so many big ideas covered throughout this book that I feel like I can't really give enough time to them all, but I am going to kind of try and quickly whip through them. Mostly they come up in the form of all these different conflicts. So there's women versus men, there's the powerful versus the powerless. So in this case, that's like the powerful being the state and the powerless being the villagers. The old generation of the fishermen villagers, and there's the newer generation who are already living in the city or very keen to do so. So that comes down to like an urban versus rural kind of conflict as well. A lot of those ideas are kind of all related to one thing, which is the villagers being displaced from their homes. It touches on the negative effects of urbanization and the importance of community as well. For me, that brought to mind the Māori concept of turanga waiwai, having a place to stand, pretty much where your roots are, and how important it is to stay connected to that and to have like this sense of home. And because it reminded me of that, it reminded me of a book called Ko Tiki by Patricia Grace. That one is the story of a Māori community. There are people trying to force them out of their land because they want to build something else there. And it's coastal land as well, so it has a similar sort of vibe. I would say that if you enjoyed Portiki, that you would probably enjoy this as well. The only difference, or the main difference that stood out to me, was the fact that in Portiki the people really come together and work together as a community. They stand really strongly together, and they might express it in different ways, but they have the same goal in mind. Whereas in this book the village is kind of divided. Araz is really the only man who wants to stand up for them. I would say that the difference, like the reason there's that difference, is that in Turkmenistan the consequences sometimes of standing up for yourself against the Soviet Union were something they kept referring to in this book, was that they might get exiled to Siberia. And I just think having that fear in the back of your mind that you might be exiled to Siberia, it would be a pretty good discourager from standing up for yourself. So I can understand why a lot of the people in this village were like too scared to take that kind of action. And it just goes to show how repressive it was as a country at that time. Yeah, so I think fear is dealt with in a really great way. It's really humanized so that you can empathize with these people, even though you kind of know that they're not necessarily doing the right thing, they're not doing the heroic thing, but you understand why they feel that they can't. But it also shows the ways in which fear can give rise to things like sin, and is ultimately like detrimental to everyone, and the best thing you can do is be brave. The other main conflict dealt with in this book is the one between women and men. This concept is introduced by the ghost Aypi, who kind of understandably has a bit of a grudge against the men of the village. To be frank, she is very hateful towards men. She does at times raise some really good points, how women shouldn't have to be ashamed for things that are not their fault. She calls out double standards in terms of gender in a few places, which is good. She speaks about how aggression is often just masked fear, how aggression shouldn't really be a masculine ideal because you're not showing yourself to be like tough by being aggressive, you're showing yourself as being weak. Despite all of these points though, I can't bring myself to call her a feminist or anything like that, because there's an equal number of reasons that I don't feel she has the best view on things. She gets a little bit too Freudian for my liking. She talks a bit about how men are weak because they're obsessed with the fact that they were weaker than their mothers at one point, and she goes into that, and I'm not a fan of that whole concept. Gender roles in her outlook as well are also really clearly ingrained, and she definitely clearly has a perception that men and women are fundamentally different, and we should have different expectations for how they should behave, or like what roles they can do. She thinks that men and women have completely different responsibilities and different natures, really, which is something that I personally disagree with. In saying all of that though, this is a culture, like Turkmenistan obviously is a place and a culture that I am completely unfamiliar with, so I don't know if I can even make a fair comment about the gender relations in this context, because I don't know what is like the normal. So I don't know if Aypi as a character is very like extreme in her views, because to me, being a woman in the Western world in New Zealand, like some of her views are still backwards, but maybe she was, in Turkmenistan's standards, maybe she's very forward thinking, I'm not sure. And that's just something about reading a book from a culture that isn't your own. It's really interesting because you get these different viewpoints. There were unfortunately quite a large number of grammatical errors throughout this book, which is always a bit disappointing because it does, for me, it like is a bit distracting. Stuff like speech marks being missing or things being out of place. And there were also a few sort of like proverbs and idioms and things like that that were just a bit lost in translation, but that would happen regardless of what text it was, you know, that always happens with translated things. So however, I still highly recommend this book if you want to, you know, expand your reading to books from different countries, or if you enjoy a good philosophical discussion, I think you'll enjoy this book, so I definitely recommend it if that's the case. Overall, I rated this 4 out of 5 stars. Leave a comment down below if you've read it, what you thought of it, or if you're thinking of picking it up, and I'll see you guys in another video in a couple days. If you want to follow what I'm reading in the meantime, you can follow me on Goodreads, Instagram and Twitter, which are always linked down below, and I'll see you guys in a couple of days. Thanks for watching. Bye.